welcome everybody to this presentation. All yours.
Okay, thank you, John. So thanks everyone for being here this morning. What I would like to do is to talk about one of the strategies we're using to address our sustainability challenge, and that's of course electrification. And what I've done is tried to create a bit of a two-part talk. And in the first part, what I want to do is explain what electrification is, why we see this as a good strategy, some of the implications of what's happening now. And then from that, hopefully we all get up to speed on the electricity system. And what we'll learn is that storage is obviously a fairly important piece of this puzzle. And so the second part will just focus on storage and grid-related storage technologies in particular. So you know how these things are. Last night, what seemed like a really good idea, I woke up this morning and thought, oh, maybe it's not such a great idea. So I've got a fair amount of material here that I'm trying to pull together into one story. We'll see how it goes. So the plan is, as John said, I'll go through part one, and then we'll have a break, and I can top up some water, and then we'll hit part two. So yeah, let's see how we do. So, as I said, first part is going to be electrification and what this means, and I'm sure you've seen the news. It's all over the news these days, right? The strategies we should be looking at, investing in infrastructure to try and increase the pace of change. So, electrification, has been identified as a pathway for decarbonizing energy systems for quite some time. And the idea around it is essentially clean up electricity supply. And when you have a clean electricity supply, you can then substitute for fossil fuels wherever possible. And this might be known as direct electrification. And then possibly also look at indirect pathways, which would mean using clean electricity to address the really difficult to electrify demands. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. So it sounds good, and we should, as I'll show you here in a second, we should really embrace this pathway for Canada. But it's a challenge, and I think I'll just press on, because I think that's one of the key things I want to try to get everybody to understand is some of the complexities that we're looking at. So why is this an appropriate strategy for Canada in particular? This is a little bit of a dated slide, but it's really it's showing where we are in terms of our electricity system carbon intensity relative to many other jurisdictions. I'm just going to get my pointer here just in case I want to use it. So Canada, so what we see on the top here, electricity sector emissions, so grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. Canada is down here, so obviously along this axis, lower is better. And you can see some of the neighboring red here, Venezuela, Colombia, Brazil. And these are locations that all are fairly heavily invested into hydro. And a lot of what we hear, I think, right now with electrification and renewable energy additions in particular, a lot of the places that are pushing really hard would probably be quite envious of where we are today. Canada is really somewhat further down the electrification pathway than many other jurisdictions, and thinking of Europe in particular. And so we do have a real advantage in terms of going after the electrification strategy. So I always like to talk to this slide, and everybody in this room will, so sometimes I show this slide and I have to explain it to the audience, because I'm not as old as everybody here, but I'm old enough that I know the audience members won't have recognized this thing, right? This is Mousetrap. It was a game that was around when I was a kid. And I like to use it as an analogy to help understand what we're talking about, because I remember, or maybe you remember, this was a pretty cool game. You'd pull this thing out, and of course we try and put it together. And the intention is to trap a mouse underneath this cage. And we have a bit of a Rube Goldberg device here that's supposed to make it happen. And this is pretty simple stuff, right? Gears, pulleys, and inclined planes. It's about as simple as technology can be. And would this thing work? Not all the time. In fact, I feel like I usually remember the ball going, the marble getting kicked out of the can or whatever, and something would not work. Friction would interfere, poor cutout of the piece. It just didn't work the way it was supposed to. And So what's the moral here? The moral here is we think we understand the individual pieces well, and we do. They're very simple things. But when we assemble them together, new things emerge, and new things that we could not have foreseen, and it means that it doesn't operate quite the way we want it to. And I think this is a really great analogy for this challenge we're facing, not just about electrification, but broadly the sustainability challenge. When you start to push your thumb down on various, parts of it, things squirt out the sides, and where they squirt out is not quite what we think. So the other nice thing about the mousetrap analogy is a little mouse head kind of looks like a carbon dioxide molecule. Anyway, I can't hear anybody laughing, but I'll assume that was a good joke. Okay, so what do we do? How do we address this in some rational way? So we as energy system analysts and designers and engineers obviously bring a lot of computational tools to bear. And what we've been working on in ISFIC for quite a while, ISFIC's about 30 years old, it's really about pathway analysis. So instead of picking just a state, and that's really easy to do, we can define a state in terms of we want to be at some state for carbon, which we're doing with policy, defining targets for 2030, 2040, 2050. What we believe is actually the critical piece is the pathway to those states. So when you start thinking about that, it means you really need to consider existing investment, existing infrastructure, and to wisely do a transition means you want to use your resources and your capital as efficiently as possible. And so you need to bake that into the pie, because it will dictate really what might be a preferred pathway for one jurisdiction is a little different, or quite a bit different, from some other jurisdictions. And so what you see in the slide is a picture that represents Western Canada, of course. And we've been doing some work on this, specifically looking at the BC Alberta coupling, or potential for coupling, and how one jurisdiction might help the other. And what we do here is we look at the specific characteristics of these two regions in terms of their resources, their economies, the demand structure, and then try to insert some economic parameters, technology and policy assumptions. And then we use some fairly complicated models to say what happens when I want to go to the future and I want to get to some future state with some defined constraints around options that are available. And what we would like to get out of this is some idea of what the emissions look like, what's the structure of the energy system, and what, how resilient is this structure that we think we want to build, and of course what is the cost. And cost is just one aspect of the value or the benefit that we might get. So now I'm going to jump to the Electricity System 101, and I want to walk through a few steps about really electrification, and at the same time try and explain the basics of how electricity systems function. And so, we're all at the end of the electricity system, in a sense, the end of these lines where electricity is delivered to, and we sit and turn on our computers, we turn on our appliances, we do whatever we want to do. And this, of course, is generating some sort of demand for the electricity system. So we see that in this little figure here, and it's a dynamic demand. And the unique aspect about electricity as compared to some other currencies or some other vectors for energy and materials is this need for this nearly instantaneous match of supply and demand. So I'll come back to this again. This is where storage obviously falls into the equation. So so then we need to think, okay, if this is what people want, how do we deliver it? And we need to start to characterize the behavior. What is this demand like? And the idea is basically what we build that goes from our switches in our house back to the generation should not just, we don't start at supply, although that's the flow of direction of energy. Really, the system is built to reflect what the demand is, or at least it should be if you're delivering what people want. So you can start to break it out and talk about what's the energy requirement when you look over a certain period of time. Of course, so what I've shown here is the dynamic part, it's power. And if we start to integrate and look at a defined time frame, is it a day or a year, we can talk about the energy that's associated with that power flow. And then we can start to think about how much do we really need? And that can, of course, mean, well, perhaps we can control a little bit of demand, which is what we're showing on the right side of the figure. And once we've identified how much demand there is to control, we can start to think about what actually needs to be built to serve this. And we might throw in some extra stuff as well. So we have some reserve capacity for unforeseen eventualities. A reserve margin is the term that the utility would say, and this would mean we'd build a little bit extra or a defined amount of extra capacity just in case things don't quite go the way we think. Okay, so here's a snapshot. I've used quite a few slides. Actually, you'll see it come from the Energy Information Administration, the US DOE, and they're very good about putting out just brief updates about what's happening. And so I thought this was a useful figure to look at. This is from February of this year, and looking at seasonality of demand in the United States. And what we see is essentially the seasons, winter, spring, summer, fall, January, April, July, and October, and we see basically a week. Okay, so you can see the amplitude of variation, and this is with everything aggregated together. If we could magically do that, you'd see this dynamic signal if you put a meter on it. And of course, in the United States, unlike Canada, Canada's typically, when we look at the dynamics for Canada, often the peaks will show up in the winter period. However, in the US, especially where a lot of people live in southern climates, air conditioning load drives up their demand in the summer and actually makes summer the peak demand period for electricity. And you can see some fairly high amplitude variations over a day because of that. And so I just mentioned the air conditioning, and this you can split this now into smaller regions. So what I just showed you was essentially an aggregation of the country, and that's not how we actually built this infrastructure. That's not how the supply works. It's broken down into smaller chunks. And so what we're getting at here is some of these smaller pieces, and it's showing how, again, the northern parts of the US would vary as compared to some of the southern and the cooling dominated districts. So let's build this up a little bit now in complexity. Basically what we have is this demand profile that I've talked about. We have some supply options, and we're going to build supply being resources that we can access, and we build a bunch of technology and connect it together to make these things match. Now, as I said, one of the tricks with electricity is we need instantaneous matching. And so demand, we've just seen some demand profiles. So here's just a representative figure showing that variability that can show up. Maybe this is one day. And then we can look over to the left and say, well, okay, I want to serve this demand. Here's a couple of options I have. And if you look at the area underneath this line, it's equivalent to the energy we need to provide over this time period. Assuming the area under both of these is the same, both A and B would provide equal amounts of energy, and that energy would match what we need. Okay, so that's sort of the first pass screening, saying, yeah, these could do the job. Now, how do we start to down select, right? And so what I've said is, what if the cost of A is equal to B? And why am I saying this? Because part of the discussion we hear is usually around specific single generation technologies and their levelized cost. Levelized cost being, let's just look at this individual thing. Let's call it a wind farm. We can calculate the energy that's being produced. We can normalize it by the cost, and we have a levelized cost. So now what I'm saying with these two examples here is potentially both of them have the same energy output to match demand, and they both have the same cost. So then how do you pick them, right? And obviously you can see that, well, to pick the one we want, it's going to be difficult to get a good match using A, because A's just got a profile that doesn't align with demand. B looks quite a bit better. B looks like it might actually be the same, and it is, because I cut and paste it. So that would be that would help reflect the value difference between these two. So I think this is part of the discussion, or what we need to really understand is there's a difference between cost and value when it comes to a system. If you're just looking at individual things, that's fine. But when you have a collection of technologies operating a system, when you start to add or choose new ones, the cost is not necessarily the only determinant, or it may not be the determinant at all. It's a value problem that we're trying to solve. Okay, so this, in this case, the value of B would be greater than the value of A. What if I don't like B? What if B is something I've just decided I don't want to use? Sure, it matches everything, but let's say B is, I don't know, a large run-of-river facility. I don't want run-of-river because I'm tired of run-of-river. I want A. And so the question is, well, if you want A, we need to do something. If we're going to have an instantaneous match and balance and a reliable system, something's got to happen here. And this is where we start to look at the piece in between and say, well, what can we do? Okay, if I can only control demand a little bit, and I don't have much control over supply, I have to do something in the middle that's going to allow me to do proper matching. Okay, so here's a sort of the list of options I've just talked through. Control demand, well, maybe a little bit. Can we integrate with another region? This aggregation effect, maybe that can help us. Do we curtail supply? Do I just decide I'm going to build A, I build lots of it, so this minimum here is going to match the demand peak in the day, and then I've got a bunch of extra I'm going to curtail. That means I'm just going to not take it, I'm going to throw it away. Or do I use some storage to help? Maybe I'll take a bunch of this energy here, I'll tuck it into storage, and then when I don't have a lot of supply during the day, I'll make up for that by pulling it out of my store so that I can get the sum to match this temporal profile. Okay, so that's basic electricity system goal. It's got an instantaneous match of these two things. So let's look at a region or a schematic that's a little bigger. And in this case, I've got a schematic that's somewhat general in terms of, let's break out now the pieces that connect supply to demand. And I've made it so it looks a little bit like BC. Okay, so on the right-hand side, remember demand drives everything. So let's talk about the right-hand side. We can start to think about what is the demand made up of. And again, this will depend upon a local jurisdiction. What's the economic structure? Do you have a lot of particular type of industry that has certain profile, like us with mining and pulp and paper and forestry? That's some big demands with certain profiles. Your commercial breakdown. Of course, residential is a really important one. We'll come back to that. And so I want to meet demand, and I can imagine some wires connecting to these various loads and going back to what we might call the grid. And the grid is a large number of conductors with some power conditioning equipment and connectors, right? And so where do I get it from? Well, if we're in BC, I have a connection to Alberta. That's AESO. So we can do some trade, or we could buy some energy from Alberta if we want to. Maybe I should build that link even bigger, take more from Alberta. They probably like that. We have another very strong, even a much stronger link than the one to Alberta that goes south into the United States, which is to a point our typically called mid-sea, mid-Columbia trading point. And then if we don't want, these are outside jurisdictions, well, if we stay within the province, what do we have? And we don't have all of the things I've shown here, but I've just tried to represent a suite of options that we might be trying to pick from. And the challenge will be to determine which ones we want to pick. So in the case of BC, we already have invested in particular choices, and that's a lot of large reservoir hydro, which you can see up at the top. Sort of a two-river system. We've got our Williston Dinosaur and Site C being built right now, and then we've got the Kinbasket and Revelstoke on the Columbia. And then a lot of run-of-river. So these others are large reservoirs associated with them. These generators do. And then we have a lot of smaller run-of-river with no real storage capability. There's also biomass. We have a lot of forest industry and forest waste. Geothermal, not so much, but that's a resource we do have. And then we've got obviously wind, solar, natural gas, and maybe some other stuff. So these are the options, the palette of options that are available. And we need to apply some of these constraints around what are the resources characteristics, what are the cost implications of building these things, what are the social, and what are the GHG implications, of course. And then ultimately, we need a combination of things that will work well. So now I want to explain how this is normally done, right? And normally what's done is to try and make a reliable energy delivery system that is minimum cost. Okay, so let's walk through very quickly. Again, here's a demand, electricity demand over some time, and if we've got a really good idea of what this is, we can try to build out a collection of generation units that we feel are going to serve our needs. So perhaps we want to build some renewable generation. Okay, so here's our demand, here's some renewable generation and some arbitrary profile. And this could be something like sun or wind. Okay, so you'll see this VER, variable energy resource, show up now and then, and this is a term usually meant to describe typically solar and wind these days, but variable renewable. So it's a renewable that has some variability, unlike something like geothermal, which tends to be a fairly steady supply if you build it. Okay, so if I have this demand and I've decided I'm going to use some renewables, the question then becomes, what's the balance I need to build? And to figure that out, we typically start to look at what's left over, or what's called the residual load. So if I take this load here and I've decided I'm going to build this particular combination of renewables, I'm just going to subtract this from the demand, and now I need to serve what's left over. Okay, so that would be the residual. So I've got my residual, and we often talk about a load duration curve. So if I take this information, I can order it from the highest to the lowest. And this is what's called a load duration curve. So here's the maximum load that shows up for 1 hour of the year, and here's the distribution over the entire year of typical loads that would show up. And I've shown this dashed line. That dashed line would represent just demand. What the solid line is what's left over, because I've already assumed I'm going to build some of this renewable. And I'm using this as an example because this is what we're now doing, is we're mandating, or we're using policy and regulation to drive the construction of certain types of assets. A lot of this going on in Europe and the US, using policy, using financial incentives and things like that. Okay, so now what do? Well, I look at what I think I have that I can use to serve this load. So what does that mean? I have a collection of generators I'm prepared to maybe invest in, and the way we characterize those, these would be all termed dispatchable generators. This is technology I control and I can dispatch as needed to meet that instantaneous demand. And I'm only showing 3 here, but all these are cost curves. Here's technology 1, technology 2, technology 3, and it's showing me what is the cost for this technology as a function of how much have I installed, the dollars per year I would have to pay, and depending on how much I operate it. Okay, so this axis down here is capacity factor, which means basically how much do you use it. Up at the far end would be 100%. So if I use this technology all the time, i.e. base load it, it's fully going. Technology 1 here shows me, okay, what do these lines mean? What the lines mean is that if I go to 0, the cost here is the fixed cost, right? I'm not operating it, so this would represent what it just costs to build it. The slope of the line is an indication of how efficient it is, right? It's an operational cost. So the difference between 1 and 3 is a very cheap technology to build. I can buy it and build it. It doesn't cost a lot, but it's not very efficient. The operational cost is high, and if I use it a lot, I'm going to pay a lot. Versus technology 1, which might be a huge investment, but it has fairly low operational costs. The example that's often used for something like this would be large hydro or a nuclear facility. You have to pay a big chunk up front, but the benefit is the low operational cost. So what does this mean? Well, I look at my screening curves. If these are technologies I'm willing to use, I can look at what's my base load on here. I go down here and say, well, I need to run at least this much 100% of the year. It looks like this would be the cheapest technology I should install for that. So I could, in theory, install that much capacity, maybe some more. Okay, but you could go through and optimally come up with what's the mixture that would give me the least overall cost. And that's what we end up with in the end, is this, I've already done I've mandated, or I somehow have a policy about, or a choice, or maybe it's existing already, like with hydro. I've already got this amount of renewable generation, and now to meet that residual, I'm going to install some mixture of some other technologies. And this is what I get. Once you have that information, you can create what's known as the supply stack. And I'm showing you here an actual picture of the supply stack for Alberta from 2017. Okay, so instead of 3 technologies, you're going to have a lot of technologies, a lot of different, maybe similar types perhaps, but they have different operational characteristics, different costs because of their age and their specific details. And so you can create this supply stack, which is basically look at all of the different generators we have in our mix. You order them from the cheapest operational cost to the highest. And so then very simple way to run it is to say, I just figure out where my demand is. Right now in Alberta, I could go and look at their website, and it will probably say something around 8 gigawatts. according to this supply stack, the best way to serve that 8 gigawatts is I should dispatch, or I should have everything to the left running and serving the load. Tonight, when the load's gone up because everybody's making dinner, I'm going to be moving to the right. And as I do that, I'm getting into other generators I need to call on, and they're more expensive, right? That's because we've ordered this from least cost to most expensive. So then I get into some things that are going to cost more. And the way this wholesale market or the electricity market typically works is whatever that intersection is, that's the price of electricity that everybody's going to pay. So if I'm down here, I'm going to receive that payment, and that means I'm making a little more profit on top of this cost. The other thing I wanted to point out, which is interesting about Alberta, typically a supply stack, right, should start at some number down at 0 and go up, 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 up. If we look carefully, this curve is actually starting, it's not at 0. We're not down at the very bottom of the supply stack. We're already way up around 6 gigawatts, but it's at 0. We have, in this particular time in Alberta, you could call, there was 6 gigawatts of generation that was essentially 0 cost. So this is, again, a complexity we won't talk about a lot, but this gets into some really interesting problems around if it's 0 cost and my demand gets down to 6, that says I should be, that's $0. I don't have to pay for that energy. But there's equipment over here that's providing it. How are they paying for it? Okay, and so this, I think you can start to understand when we start to put in very, very low operational costs, which usually means renewables. That's one of the great things about them. Low carbon, low operational cost. They drive down the supply stack price. And then how do they, it's almost like they eat their own lunch. They drive down the price, which is good for consumers, but it disincents actually investing in cheap stuff like, or low carbon stuff like that, because you can't make money without some help. Okay, I'm greatly simplifying things, but I'm trying to do the electricity system 101 as fast as possible. So now what we've just gone through would be what a balancing authority, being a BC Hydro and Alberta, would do to manage their jurisdiction. But the electricity system is not individual jurisdictions. We are interconnected. And so this is a representation of the various interconnections in North America, and the green, so the very shades of green here, and you see BC and Alberta are in that green. This entire chunk has strong connections. Some are weaker than others, some are stronger, but basically this entire region, which is called WEC, the Western Electricity Coordinating Council area, is physically connected together. So in theory, an outage down here will be felt throughout the whole system. If a big generator goes down or if a big transmission line goes down, it will ripple through the system. But the area and the amount of generation in this is so big, a big plant going down can be quite a little tiny ripple. Okay, so that's one of the benefits that comes with a big interconnected system, is the exchange of energy, the reliability benefits that come with that. And historically, when we built electricity in North America around the turn of the century, it was sort of the last, not this past one, but the one before, where we were just starting, we've essentially had thousands and thousands of small generation units that serve their local, either their town or their city. And over time, we started to connect them all together. And that connecting was basically the least cost way to provide highly reliable service. So when we look at what's going on today, you can start to really drill down and look at the real physical connections in the systems. And again, because this is EIA information, it really only shows North America, the continental US, and you can see Canada's just some red dots. And the fact is that in Canada, most of our really strong connections are north-south. BC strong ones, north-south, 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 very, very strong north-south in the eastern side. Manitoba, very strong north-south, very weak east-west. And so this is a fun one to talk about, because we do see this in the news quite a bit these days. A lot of talk about, why don't we build a stronger east-west grid in Canada? And that's a complicated problem, but as the very, very first pass on it, why would you? Because as I've showed you so far, I think Canada has low carbon electricity. the cost is actually very low compared to most jurisdictions in the world. And if I'm going to actually sell anything, I want to sell it to whoever's going to pay the highest amount, and that's south. If you look south, BC, we don't actually have a lot of benefit because there's so much hydro south of it. The cost difference is not huge. But when you go to Manitoba, Manitoba has hydro, and if they go south, they're moving into a fairly expensive market. They make a lot of money. Quebec makes a ton of money because they're able to serve the most expensive jurisdiction in North America. The electricity prices in the Northeast here are far beyond most of the rest of the US and Canada. So Quebec, yeah, we see, yeah, Quebec could send clean electricity west, but if they're going to do that and they're going to build the infrastructure, you got to ask, well, why wouldn't they be trying to sell this excess power south? So anyway, there's other reasons for it. I just wanted to point that one out because that's a topic that's in the news a lot. All right, that's Electricity Systems 101. I'm going to try and move along still pretty quickly so we have some time for a break. And so that's how the system kind of works. Now let's do the electrification strategy. And step one is decarbonize generation. And we've already got a lot of decarbonized electricity generation in Canada. So some of the stuff I'll talk about now is really more about what's happening in other jurisdictions or some of the challenges places like Germany and the UK are facing, or places that just don't have the low carbon, reliable, flexible stuff we typically have. So to do this, I'm going to show you an animation, a bunch of animations showing actual data. And what you'll see here, so as the title says, this is renewable resources and it's showing variability. So what we have are 3 plots. This is California. So CAISO, you'll see this come up a few times. This is a California Independent System Operator. And this is their solar production. And this is in April to May of 2017. We have, at the time, BC, of course, has some wind facilities. This will show you the BC wind production. And then we have wind production south of us. BPA is south of us down Washington, Oregon area. And there's some big, excellent wind assets down there. Okay, so and you can see that by the scale. So you see this scale goes up to 4 gigawatts versus BC. We're only up to about 500 megawatts. And then in California for solar, it's up around 10 gigawatts. So a huge amount of solar. So I'm going to hit go. If this works the way it's supposed to, you're going to see 24-hour snapshots show up moving forward in time. And well, let's just watch it. Okay, so we can see going through the year, it's a year, oh sorry, not a year, April to May. It's showing each day overlaid upon the next day. And we've got the absolute magnitude of these resources, their productive profile. And by laying one on top of the other, you get a sense of this variability. And variability is, there's nuances to it, of course, and you can see right away why. We know solar is variable, but it certainly looks much more predictable than this center plot or the one on the right, right? These, when you look at this 24-hour snapshot for this duration, it's hard to see really any pattern there. Things come and they go. And down below, you can see actually the time series, right? And it's quite small signal here because of the low amounts. Look on the right, though, you can see some big changes. Again, remember, we're talking about 4 gigawatts, which can show up and disappear very, very quickly. Solar, you see some definite variability in here over this time period. And remember, this isn't a full year, so it's only 1 month. So we're really only capturing a month of variability. But of course, with solar, you know it's not going to be there at night. So that's those missing pieces there. And if you overlay all of this, this is for February 28, 26. This is a full year. Instead of looking at a month, we get a full year. So again, there's variability in solar, but it's definitely got a fairly clear diurnal pattern to it. Whereas BPA wind, that looks like a piece of artwork you might put on your wall. If you stare at it long enough, something emerges. I don't think I've seen any of those around anymore, but I remember there was a time when those were popular. So what does this mean? Because we know California's been pushing hard to clean up electricity, and they don't have the hydro we have. So they've been pushing hard from various ways to get more of this more desirable generation in, and the desirable for them being more wind and solar. So you've probably seen this curve or heard of it, this impact of adding these variable renewables. California, because they're ahead of the curve in North America, has been looking at what's been happening as they've increased the amount of solar and wind in their system. And what you see here is this, a day in spring, or typical spring day as they call it, showing the essentially net load. This net load being what's the demand minus my solar and wind input. And this is what they call a duck curve, and they call it a duck curve because if you look at that, supposedly it looks like a duck. There's the beak, there's the tail, at least that's what I see. Again, if you stare at it long enough, something emerges. And what we see are snapshots in time, and this is 2012 year going forward, and then there's some projections based upon planned additions of more solar, more wind. And you can see how the load shape is changing, right? You see this little double hump in 2012, which is fairly typical of many places. There's that morning, everybody gets up and the load ramps up. Middle day, things drop again, and then you have that evening peak. Well, as more and more of this variable renewable has been added, and you look at what the residual is, what is it that everything else needs to be built to serve, this is what we see. So 2013 actual, 2014, 15, 16, and then we see some projections at the time. So the date of this is older. So this 2020 was a projection at the time. And this is what gives you the so-called belly of the duck. So all that 10 gigawatts of sun coming on during the day, when you subtract it, it's pushing down. And so, you know, part of the message here is that's a good news story because we don't need as much dispatchable generation, non-renewable perhaps. So again, the area under this curve being energy, that's a good news story. We're reducing the energy required there. Now we're getting in, and keep in mind that 10 gigawatts sounds like a lot, but compared to California's total demand, it's not a huge amount. It's good, but it's not, we're not talking like 80%, 90% or anything like that. And so the dynamics are becoming more and more challenging. And so what this figure is trying to highlight is the effect of the sudden disappearance of sun in the afternoon and evening when the demand shows up, and you get this ramping that has to happen from the belly up to the peak. And at the time, and I think this, I think I grabbed this, okay, let's see here, this is 2016, so actual 3-hour ramp, about 11 gigawatts was called on in 3 hours in February 1st, 2016. Keep in mind this is roughly the order of magnitude of the very peak demand for British Columbia. So in California, they needed to basically dispatch everything we have in BC in 3 hours to ramp it up to meet this changing net load. And as they projected forward, they thought in 2020 they'd be here, but they actually were below this belly in May of 2016. And if you've been paying any attention, of course, there's lots of news about California with the fires this year. One of the things I'm on is a little mailing list from the California AESO. And one of the things I was getting, and actually got one, I think it was a few days ago, is what they call a flex alert. So they will email customers now to say, control your use, try not to turn things on during this period because they know they're going to have some challenges that show up. Okay, so yeah, here's actually I grabbed some data so you can see the date here. This is February of this year, and again, looking at this duck curve, here's the demand in green, and then this is the residual, and then in February this year, we're up to about 14.5 gigawatt ramp in 3 hours. And so this gets to the idea of flexibility. The balancing stuff that we need to balance our system needs to have flexibility, and the ability to maneuver and ramp up or down very quickly is one characteristic of flexibility. So what I've talked about is kind of captured on this one figure, which shows what can happen to a load duration curve as you add more and more uncontrollable, variable, renewable resources. And this is from a paper that's getting a bit dated, which was about Germany, because Germany was pushing hard on the energy transition for electricity, and the dashed line was sort of a pre-today low duration curve, and then this was a representation of some future state once some variables have been added. And it changes the shape, and how it changes the shape has implications. The steepness that we see is going back to what I've just been talking about ramping needs. Okay, that's an indication of ramping and flexibility. The peak up here, we typically don't see it go down much. That's bad news. Okay, so this is what's called low capacity credit. It means even though I've installed a whole bunch of this other technology that's variable, I can't actually get rid of a lot of dispatchable capacity because of the characteristics of it. There's still some time where I need basically full capacity because I'm not going to have a lot of credit from those renewables. So that's bad because it means even though I might be getting a lot of energy from those variables, I can't retire some other generation, and that generation still has to be paid for, even though I might not be operating it much. There's still a cost. If you really push hard, you can try and you can get to this place where you actually have so much renewable, you've got more than you possibly could, and you've got a negative residual load. That's overproduction. And in 2013, this was somewhat theoretical, but it's not anymore. And I'll show you some figures on this. So how do you, again, we're going to go back to sort of how do you make this system work? And this is a good one because Denmark often gets pointed to as a bit of a good example of being able to, get off some fossil fuels using wind in particular. And I grabbed this, I can't remember when it was, 2015, yeah, because I saw this in the news in 2015, this headline, wind power generates 140% of Denmark's electricity demand. I thought, wow, that's pretty neat. So this was in 9th of July, 1044. This is a system snapshot of what was going on. And you can see a little summary in the blue box, and it shows wind generation, net being exported, and energy demand. So you can see the wind generation is in excess of demand, and there's some other things that are must run or have to be running, and so there's a lot of export. And you can see the export in orange going off to Norway, Sweden, and some going into Germany. But what's interesting is there's also imports going on. Imports at the same time, even though they've got excess coming in from Germany, coming in from Sweden, and again, some from Sweden. And so these headlines about sort of these little pockets having 100%, 140% of demand are a bit misleading, because the only way this can work is that Denmark is not an island. Electricity systems are large integrated systems. So what we really should be talking about is the larger interconnected network, and then some, that's just the reality of it. And picking just some little boundary, a country boundary, is somewhat arbitrary when it comes to electricity, because the electricity does not observe the boundaries. So electricity flows wherever it wants to based on our connections. And the analogy I heard, which I thought was quite good, is the way the electricity system works is kind of like one of these performers who would be on stage with those poles with spinning plates on them. And basically that person is running around spinning the plates to try and make sure none of them fall and crash. And that's a bit how we run our system. We don't control the flow of the electrons. We do sometimes, but mostly it goes where we've made the connections. And it's about spinning up things and moving them fast enough to make sure everything stays in balance. So anyway, this was in the news, and I think the very next, was it the next day? No. So when it was in the news, I went and looked at it again. I think this is probably when I saw it. I went and looked at it on 20th of July. And 20th July at midnight, Denmark is surviving on 50% imports. So these instantaneous news flashes, like 1 hour or whatever, there's 140%. We really have to be careful about what we think of that. We do need to think about the larger system and think about over time what's happening. So basically this system works because, by the way, where do they import from and where do they export a lot of their energy to? Norway and Sweden are large hydro jurisdictions. They have flexibility. They can actually serve this variability in Denmark because of that large hydro asset. Let's jump back to California. So California, wind and solar curtailment over time, again, when you get into overproduction, and overproduction might become a problem not because you actually have now got zero, you've served all the load and you've got extra. It can become a problem because you just can't move energy. You don't have enough transmission capacity to actually move it from where you got a lot to where the load is. And then you basically have to get into curtailment. And so you can see the trend in California as we progress through time, going back from 2014 up to basically January of this year. What this figure is showing is the amount of energy that's being curtailed in California because of this inability to get renewable supply to a load center. This came out just a little while ago, and it's talking about the first 9 months of 2020 in Europe. And what the figure is showing is a number of hours where negative pricing shows up. So not only is it at zero, it's gone negative. And you can see Germany and Ireland in particular with the highest number of hours where negative pricing shows up. Basically, you're being paid as a consumer to take the energy so that the system can stay balanced. And this is, again, like California, is an increasing occurrence. So how do you manage this? And I'm gonna move a little bit quicker. How you manage it is using multiple resources, and the one I'll get to in part 2 is about storage. California, though, how do they manage it? A lot like Denmark. And if we look at this figure, again, this is for February 3rd of 2020, showing California's supply. You can see down below we have a number of things going on. Green, the renewables, we see it ramp up again as the sun comes on and there's wind in there. You can see natural gas, which is considered to be a fairly flexible resource. Large hydro, not a whole lot in there. We're just down near the zero axis. Nuclear, coal, other. Look at that one right here in the middle. Imports. So again, trading and the transmission interconnection California has is used to really manage balancing this supply-demand situation where you have a lot of variability. Okay, electrification step 2. We've cleaned up our supply. Now we need to use that clean electricity and substitute for fossil fuel technology. So back to my picture that's somewhat BC-centric, really we're talking about over here on this side, bringing in technologies like heat pumps or electric vehicles or distributed solar for, and that could be PV, but it could also be distributed solar for hot water. And using those as a way to use our clean electricity or use local clean supplies, obviously to reduce our fossil fuel. And we are also talking about the addition of some storage that's at, even at the residential scale. So what does this mean? If we're going to now, I've just said we've got pretty clean electricity, so let's use it to decarbonize. What does it mean in terms of additional supply or demand, and also the type of demand? What is the shape, the profile? Because we know that's very important for capacity. I'm just going to focus again on our western part of the country. I'm showing here Alberta and BC. This is 2013 data. It's hard to get really up-to-date data, but this is secondary energy demand for these two jurisdictions. And you can see it's really focused on transportation and current, at the time, electricity demand. This is Alberta and this is BC. You can see they're roughly similar. BC annual demand on the order of 60 terawatt hours. Alberta, it's a little bit higher. Scales here are a little different, and that's because Alberta's transportation fuel demand is quite a bit larger than BC, and that's a reflection of the geography, the location people live in, and the type of industry that's there. So that's a large number, right? And BC, we're up around 100 in terms of terawatt hours for that chemical fuel that we're using. So now we're saying, let's electrify this. Let's electrify these. What does that mean? Here's a snapshot of transportation broken out by various modes for all of Canada in 2013. And I've just highlighted light duty cars. Okay, that's this bar here. Then what it's showing is the various modes and their GHG emissions. So let's assume we're going to do all of the electric vehicles. Well, that's great. That's a good chunk, but there's still some pretty large chunks left over, and these are challenging ones. So the cars here, if I were to electrify every single one in that time, this is on the order of about, in terms of energy, remember there's a profile we still need to consider, but in terms of energy on an annual basis, it's about 50 terawatt hours. So this is about equivalent to building an entire BC generation system. What about heat? Well, I don't have a great figure that's for Canada in terms of heat, but I've got one that's for the US. And what this figure shows is essentially the type of heat and where it's used and how much. So the type being, what's the temperature that we want the heat at? So typical home use is fairly low, but then we've got industrial use. And then what we've got is a quantity on the vertical axis. So you can take this type of information, which tells us about demand, and if we say we want to electrify it, you can estimate roughly what that means. And in pure sort of electricity equivalent terms, this heat, if it were to be completely electrified, is on the order of magnitude of existing electricity demand in the US. Okay, I'd say equivalent to 50, but then this is just the end use. And so if you actually have some efficiencies between the end use and the generation, we're talking about additional generation, roughly the order of magnitude of electricity demand in the US. So, I know I don't want to sound scary, but these are some big numbers, and we got a lot of opportunity to get at those through electrification. I've just shown you some rough energy numbers, but we need to get the profiles, because this is a key part of the cost. How much equipment, how much transmission infrastructure do you actually need to have? And that is hard to figure out, but it means you need to have some dynamics. You need to see how they correlate and aggregate and add up. And then how does it reflect what you have access to through trade and through your jurisdiction? And so just doing the residential side can be challenging, just because there's so much uncertainty around the types of technologies that we will be having at the residential scale and what their performance characteristics will be as we move forward. Doing it for BC though, for transportation, leads to some interesting numbers, right? So this is a figure that's trying to show roughly, if you consider the energy of transportation being electrified, plus the dynamics that then drive capacity of electricity, we potentially have some large numbers, right? So here's roughly the existing capacity in BC, about 16, right? And that's in the excess of our peak demand. But we may be looking at a significant amount more if we don't change the behaviors, the usage patterns. We still have the same type of driving people kilometers and freight kilometers or more, because we expect population growth. We got some big numbers here, and we really need to think about bringing some other tools to bear. And I'm just about done here, so we can do our break. And I wanted to get to step 3, and step 3 says, once you've done all the easy electrification, heat pumps, that's easy. Light duty electric vehicles, that's pretty easy these days. Yeah, there's cost, but we can see a pathway. There's still a lot of hard stuff left over. Long haul transportation, aircraft, industrial heat needs. These are more challenging. So electrification step 3, I'm trying to represent this idea on this figure, where what we do to support a lot of those right now is through a chemical infrastructure, right? Chemical fuels, which often come from fossil fuels. We may still need some sort of chemical mode. And in the next part, when I talk about storage, I'll show you why. And that can still couple into an electrification strategy. And you can see on this diagram how that might happen. You know, we have a natural gas system feeding demand, and what you see between this green natural gas and the clean electricity is perhaps some couplings where we use clean electricity to do something like make hydrogen, or we take natural gas and we make hydrogen and then we get rid of this and sequester this CO2. And maybe we use hydrogen to do other things. If we have clean electrolytic hydrogen, we might methanate it. Anyway, this is getting into a more complicated story, but I wanted to point that one out, because just because there's some easy things to do, we still have some really hard stuff we got to figure out. So I'm just about done. Electrification step 4 is you got to make it all work. And I figured I had to at least have a cat picture. That seems to be the thing these days. You need a cat meme in any sort of video or presentation. So yeah, make it work. And I think I've already touched on some of the issues here. You know, this control supply. Well, we're trying to get into resources which are pretty hard to control, and we need to pay for them. We need to pay for the balancing and the dispatchable supply, possibly control demand. There are ways to do that, and maybe to incent it. There's issues around accepting that though, you know, and defection of customers from the grid is one concern. And then there's trade, stronger interconnections, making use of neighbors. Maybe they've got energy or demand at different times, and so that can work. And then, of course, a technical solution to a lot of what we've just talked about is storage. And that will be part 2